My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 35 years old. In my family, I've had a job since I was maybe 22, and it isn't the one on my resume. I'm the punchline, the one everyone gathers around the table to gently pity, the one my sister loves to needle just to watch the room laugh along with her. Every holiday, every birthday, every random Sunday dinner, there's always a moment where someone brings up my situation, like being single at 35 is a diagnosis instead of a life. What none of them knew is that I'd stopped being that person a long time ago. They just hadn't found out yet. The tree lights blinked behind my father's chair, and the smell of cinnamon and roasted chicken hung thick in the air when my sister Vanessa set her fork down with that familiar glint in her eye. "So, Claire," she said, loud enough for the whole table to catch, 35 and still single. Must be lonely spending another Christmas with just yourself, huh?" The laughter came fast, the way it always did, rolling from my uncle to my cousins to my own father, like she'd cracked open something everyone had been waiting to laugh at all night. I felt the heat climb up my neck, not embarrassment exactly, just the tired ache of familiarity. I looked toward my mother, waiting for her to do what a mother should. Instead, she reached over and patted my hand. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, sweetheart. She's only teasing." She always said that. She never once said it to Vanessa. This wasn't new, and that was the part that stung the most. It wasn't one bad joke on one bad night. It was 13 years of them, stacked up like bricks I'd learned to carry without flinching. Vanessa had started in college back when she got engaged first, and I was still figuring out who I wanted to be. "Maybe you'll find someone by 30, she'd said at her own engagement dinner, smiling like it was a gift she was giving me. I laughed it off then. Everyone did. That was the pattern. Actually, everyone laughing, like her cruelty came with a built-in audience that made it acceptable, made it cute even, made it something I wasn't allowed to be hurt by without being called dramatic. By 28, it was still waiting on Mr. Right. By 30, it was, your eggs aren't getting any younger. And every single time, I looked to my mother, and every single time, she did the same soft, practiced thing with her face, that smile that wasn't really a smile, and she'd say some version of, "Don't be so sensitive," or "She's just teasing," or "You know how Vanessa is." She never once turned to Vanessa and said, "That's enough." Not once in 13 years. I used to think my mother didn't notice the pattern. Later, I understood she noticed everything. She just decided my discomfort was easier to manage than my sister's mouth. Vanessa wasn't finished. She never was once she had a room laughing with her. She turned to her husband, Marcus, nudging his arm like she was about to let him in on the joke of the century. "Tell her about that guy from your office, the one you were trying to set her up with. What was it? 6 months ago?" Marcus shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but Vanessa pressed on anyway. "He said no before he even met you, Claire. Isn't that something? A blind date rejection without the date." The table erupted again. My uncle wheezing, my cousin Beth actually wiping her eyes, and I sat there running the math I always ran in moments like this. If I snapped, if I raised my voice or pushed back too hard, I'd become the humorless one, the bitter one, the one who couldn't take a joke at her own family's table. That was always the trap. Respond with anything sharper than a smile, and I handed them the exact story they wanted to tell about me. So instead, I picked up my wine glass and took a slow sip, giving myself 3 full seconds to breathe before I spoke. "Wow," I said lightly, letting my voice stay easy, almost bored. 6 months ago, you really have been saving that one." Vanessa's smile faltered just slightly, thrown off that I hadn't shrunk the way I usually did, and for the first time all night, I felt something other than that old familiar sting. What none of them knew, sitting there so pleased with themselves, was that I hadn't been single in over 2 years. I'd been married for 14 months to a man named Daniel Reyes in a small courthouse ceremony with exactly 4 witnesses, none of whom shared my last name. I'd worn a cream-colored dress I bought off a clearance rack, and Daniel had cried a little when he read his vows, and it had been, without exaggeration, the happiest afternoon of my life. And I had told no one at that table. It wasn't shame. I want to be clear about that, even now. It was math. I'd watched this family take apart every partner Vanessa's friends ever brought home, watched them do it to my cousin's fiancé, picking him apart over dinner until he stopped coming to family things altogether. I'd watched them treat other people's happiness like something to be inspected for flaws, and I knew, with total certainty, that if I brought Daniel to this table, they wouldn't celebrate him. They'd find the thread to pull. They'd turn my marriage into content for their jokes the same way they'd turned my singleness into content for years. So I made a choice. I decided that the one thing in my life that was fully, uncomplicatedly good didn't need their approval to be real. I kept it separate, protected, mine. Daniel used to ask me gently if I was ever going to tell them, and I always said, not yet, not yet, not yet. Sitting there under the string lights, listening to Vanessa's laugh ring out over the table again, I realized not yet had just quietly become now. I set my wine glass down slowly, deliberately, the base meeting the tablecloth with a soft, deliberate click that somehow cut through all that leftover laughter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Years of watching Vanessa perform for an audience had taught me that the quietest moment in a loud room is the one people actually lean in for. "Don't worry about me," I said, looking directly at her, my tone almost pleasant. "I've been married for a long time." The laughter didn't fade so much as it just stopped all at once, like someone had cut the sound entirely. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Vanessa's smile stayed frozen on her face for a second too long, like her expression hadn't caught up with what her ears had just heard. "Wait," she said, blinking, her voice losing all its earlier confidence. "What do you mean, married? Since when are you married, Claire?" I let the silence stretch a little longer than was comfortable, watching confusion ripple down the table, watching my father set his knife down, watching my mother's easy, practiced smile finally falter. For the first time in 13 years, I wasn't the one scrambling for an answer at this table. "His name is Daniel," I said finally. "Daniel Reyes." The name landed harder than I expected, my father's face draining of color in an instant, my mother's hand tightening around her wine glass until her knuckles went pale. Vanessa looked between us like she was waiting for the punchline, except this time there wasn't one. Because Daniel wasn't just any name in this family's history. 4 years ago, my father's landscaping company had lost a massive municipal contract to a competing firm, one owned by the Reyes family, a loss that nearly bankrupted us and that my father had spent years blaming for every financial hardship that followed. I'd sat at this same table listening to him call them ruthless, call them thieves, watching my mother nod along like it was gospel. What none of them knew was that I'd met Daniel almost 5 years earlier, long before that contract was ever on the table, at a mutual friend's engagement party where neither of us cared about municipal bids or family grudges. When the conflict erupted, I made the choice to keep him separate from it, not out of guilt, but because I understood exactly how this family treated anything it didn't approve of. "You married into the family that ruined us," my father said, his voice low, shaking somewhere between disbelief and fury. "They didn't ruin us, Dad," I said evenly. "We lost that bid because our numbers were too high, not because anyone sabotaged you. I've seen the paperwork. I know the difference." My mother's glass hit the table hard enough to rattle the plates. "So this whole time, While your father lost sleep over that contract, you were with the enemy? I was building a life, I said, my voice steady, sharper now than it had been in 13 years of silence. While everyone at this table was busy pitying me for being alone, I said, letting my eyes move slowly from my mother to Vanessa. I was married to a man who has never once made me feel small. While you were saving jokes about my blind dates for 6 months just to get a laugh, I was building a marriage none of you were cruel enough to be trusted with. Vanessa's face had gone from smug to something closer to stunned. Her mouth slightly open like she wanted to respond but couldn't find the shape of the words. My father stared down at his plate. My mother's eyes had gone glassy, caught somewhere between shame and disbelief, and for once, she didn't reach for that practiced smile. "Why would you hide this from us?" my mother finally asked, quieter now, almost pleading. "We're your family." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because every time I brought someone home, this family found a way to make them feel small. And every time Vanessa humiliated me at this table, you told me not to be sensitive. I didn't hide my marriage out of shame. I hid it to protect it. From all of you. Nobody spoke after that. My father kept his eyes fixed on his plate, unable to meet mine. My mother's mouth opened once, then closed again, like she'd finally run out of soft, practiced things to say. Vanessa just sat there, her wineglass forgotten, the joke she'd been so proud of 20 minutes earlier now sitting heavy in the middle of the table, something none of them wanted to touch. I finished my wine in one unhurried sip, then stood, smoothing my dress, feeling steadier than I had in years. "Thank you for dinner, Mom," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. Not performed, not bitter, just done. I gathered my coat from the back of the chair and walked out of that house the way I'd always wanted to. On my own terms, my head high, nothing left unsaid, and for the first time at that table, nothing left to prove. Driving home that night, I understood something I wish I'd known at 22. You don't owe honesty to people who've only ever used your life as material for their jokes. Some things aren't secrets out of shame, they're sanctuaries, kept whole by staying quiet. I'd protected my marriage from a family that never protected me, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. If you've ever sat at a table where your own family made you the punchline, you already know exactly how it feels to finally, quietly, take your power back. If this story hit home, you already know what to do next.